He had nothing left. No family, no future, no reason to care about anyone. And yet, on the worst day of his life, standing in the mud before a crowd of sneering strangers, Rhett Mercer reached into his coat and pulled out every last dollar he owned. Not for land, not for cattle, not for anything that made sense, but for two girls nobody wanted. The crowd laughed. They always laugh at the wrong man. But the frontier has a way of proving fools right and making the rest of the world eat its words. This is that story. If you're watching till the end, hit that like button right now. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And make sure you're following so you never miss what comes next. The auction started at 10 in the morning, but the smell of it hit Rhett Mercer long before he reached the yard. Sweat and livestock and the particular sourness of men who'd been drinking since sunrise. He'd smelled it in a dozen frontier towns before this one, standing in the back of crowds just like this, watching the machinery of desperation grind forward with its usual indifference. Cattle changed hands, tools, land parcels, sometimes people. Coldwater Crossing wasn't a large town. It sat in a shallow bowl of prairie, ringed on the north side by a ridge of red rock, and on the south by a muddy river that flooded every spring and poisoned the lower fields. The kind of town that looked, from a distance, like it might amount to something. Up close, it never did. The main street was 2 blocks of weathered storefronts and a livery stable that leaned left so severely that everyone expected it to collapse in the next hard wind. It hadn't yet. People in Coldwater Crossing had learned not to expect the obvious. Rhett came into town on a grulla mare with a patched saddle and a bedroll that had seen better years. He tied her at the post outside the general store, bought a tin of tobacco he didn't particularly need, and stood on the porch watching the crowd gather in the yard behind the feed warehouse. He had no intention of buying anything. He had $43 to his name, the remainder of what he'd made driving cattle north from the Sulphur Creek Valley. And he needed most of it to see him through winter. The plan, such as it was, amounted to finding a spread willing to take on a hired hand through the cold months. Work enough to stake the spring. Go somewhere quieter after that. Somewhere people didn't ask questions. He'd been carrying that plan for almost 2 years, ever since Denton. He didn't think about Denton if he could help it. The crowd pressed tighter as the auctioneer climbed onto an upended crate and cleared his throat with the theatrical importance of a man who considered himself the axis around which commerce rotated. His name was Caldwell, and he wore a tan vest that was too tight across the middle and spoke in a voice loud enough to carry over the wind. "Folks, we've got a fine morning's offerings today. Mules, a plow rig, 2 sows." Rhett wasn't listening. He was watching a man near the fence argue with a woman over the price of a spinning wheel, and thinking that the woman was going to win, and that the man didn't know it yet. There was a particular kind of stubbornness in the set of a jaw that telegraphed the outcome of an argument before it finished. Rhett had gotten good at reading people that way. It was the kind of skill you developed when you stopped trusting them. Then the auctioneer said something that shifted the crowd's energy, and Rhett looked up. 2 girls had appeared at the edge of the platform. Not brought forward exactly, more like steered by a man in a gray coat who kept his hand at the back of the elder one's shoulder, with the casual authority of someone who'd done this before. The older girl had dark hair and eyes that were scanning the crowd with an expression Rhett recognized immediately, because he'd seen it in his own reflection a time or two. Not fear. Something harder, calculation. She was taking stock of every face out there, measuring them the same way they were measuring her. The younger one stood slightly behind her, small, thin, with the kind of stillness that children usually don't have, unless something has happened to teach them that stillness is safer. She wasn't looking at the crowd at all. She was watching a crow that had settled on the top of the fence post 10 feet away, and she watched it with such complete attention that the bird seemed to notice and stayed longer than crows usually do. Tessa Hale, 19 years, able-bodied, experienced in household work and field labor, Caldwell announced, and her sister Lydia Hale, 11 years, same. Someone in the crowd made a comment Rhett didn't catch, but several men laughed. The older girl, Tessa, heard it. Her jaw tightened. She didn't look for the source of it, didn't acknowledge it, just absorbed it the way someone absorbs a blow they've trained themselves to take without flinching. "Now these 2 come as a pair," Caldwell continued. Town's been carrying their board since the Hale homestead went under in August. Indenture terms are standard. Buyer takes both, minimum 3-year agreement, county oversees conditions. What happened to their parents? A woman in the crowd asked. Caldwell glanced at the man in the gray coat, who said nothing useful, so Caldwell pressed on. Father passed in the spring. Illness, mother prior to that. They've been housed at the Garvey widow's place these past months. You mean the shed behind it, someone else said, and this time the laugh was different, flatter, more uncomfortable. Tessa's head turned toward the voice, just slightly, just enough that Rhett saw her locate the speaker and hold him in her gaze for exactly 3 seconds before looking away. There was nothing theatrical about it. She wasn't performing anger or grief for the crowd. She was simply noting who had said it, the way you note the position of something you intend to deal with later. Rhett found himself leaning against the fence post with his arms crossed, no longer thinking about the woman and the spinning wheel. Bidding opened slow. $40? $50. A rancher named Pollard, who smelled like he'd slept in his own stock pen, raised it to $60 with the bored expression of a man adding to a grocery list. A woman beside him, wife, presumably, said something to him in a low voice, and Pollard shrugged and didn't bid again. The numbers stalled around 75. 75 going once. 100. The voice belonged to a man at the front Rhett hadn't paid much attention to. Dusk Harlan. Rhett had heard the name in the livery stable that morning, heard enough to understand the shape of the man's reputation. He ran a crew of 7, owned the largest spread of grazing land east of the river, and conducted himself in the manner of someone who'd never been told no by anyone he considered worth arguing with. Harlan wasn't looking at Tessa. He was looking at the crowd the way a man looks at a room to check who's watching him make a purchase. 105, someone countered, but weakly. 120, Harlan said, still without looking at the platform. The counter bidder went quiet. 120 going once. Rhett didn't make a decision. That was the honest truth of it, then and afterward. There was no moment of deliberation where he weighed the cost against the outcome and found a justification. Something happened faster than thinking, some machinery more animal than rational, and his hand went up and his mouth opened. 143. Caldwell blinked at him. The crowd turned. Harlan turned. Rhett had not moved from the fence post. He was still leaning with his arms crossed, and he didn't uncross them, and he was aware with a particular clarity that he had just offered every dollar he had in the world, including the emergency coin he kept in his boot, and that he was doing so in the open presence of Dusk Harlan, who looked like the kind of man who collected grudges. Harlan looked at him for a long moment. The look contained the full measure of the assessment. Who this stranger was, what he was worth, how much trouble he was likely to be. It was not a short look. 150, Harlan said. Rhett said nothing. The crowd waited. Harlan added, without volume, just carrying, "You're out of your depth, friend." "I'm not your friend," Rhett said, same even tone. Not raised, not sharpened into anything dramatic, just a statement of fact. Harlan's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He turned back toward the auctioneer. 150, final. Caldwell opened his mouth, and Rhett said, "I've got land." Which was not entirely true. He had a deed to 40 acres of scrub and rock out on the eastern edge of the territory that a dead man had handed him in lieu of a debt that would otherwise never be paid. Rhett had never seen the land. He didn't know what condition the property was in, whether the deed was even properly recorded, or whether 40 acres of eastern territory was worth anything to anyone. He knew what was written on the paper, and that was all. "Land?" Caldwell said. 40 acres, deeded, East Territory, recorded at Sulphur Creek. The crowd's murmur had a different quality now, part amusement, part genuine curiosity, with an undercurrent of the particular excitement that comes when something unexpected happens at a public event and everyone gets to watch. Harlan studied him again. "I don't want your rocks," he said finally. "Then stop bidding." There was a beat of silence. Rhett became aware of Tessa looking at him from the platform, the direct cataloging kind of attention. He didn't look back at her. Harlan let out a breath through his nose and said something to the man beside him, who laughed. Then he stepped back and waved a dismissive hand at Caldwell, who took it as withdrawal. 143 cash and deed of 40 Eastern acres. Going once, going twice, sold. The laughter started almost immediately. Rhett heard pieces of it as he pushed through the crowd toward Caldwell's table. Man just bought himself 2 more mouths to feed. East Territory. That land's nothing but hardpan and rattlesnakes. Dumbest purchase I've seen in 15 years of auctions. He counted out the cash on Caldwell's table without responding to any of it. $43. He pulled the coin from his boot and set that down too. Then he produced the folded deed from the inner pocket of his coat and placed it beside the money. Caldwell signed the transfer papers with the practiced speed of a man who'd signed hundreds. You understand the terms? County oversight for the indenture period. You're responsible for the welfare of both. I understand, Rhett said. He turned around. The crowd had partially dispersed now that the entertainment was concluded, but enough remained to form a loose semicircle of the frankly curious. Tessa and Lydia stood with the man in the gray coat, who was looking at Rhett with an expression that suggested he'd expected someone more impressive. Tessa spoke before anyone else could. We don't do certain kinds of work, she said. Her voice was steady, carrying a deliberate clarity, like someone reciting terms they'd prepared. Rhett looked at her directly for the first time. That's so. We don't do whatever Harlan was going to ask of us. Whatever you intend to ask, I intend to ask you to work a ranch, he said. That's all. She held his gaze. People say that. People lie, he agreed. I'll tell you what I told my last employer when he hired me. You'll know within a week whether I meant it. There's not much I can offer you by way of proof before that. It was a longer speech than he was accustomed to making in public. He felt the awkwardness of it, the inadequacy of words in a context where words were the only available instrument. Lydia, who had not spoken or looked away from the crow until now, turned her head and examined him with the same quiet attention she'd given the bird. It was an unnerving quality in a child, that kind of assessment without self-consciousness. She seemed to arrive at some conclusion because she tugged at Tessa's sleeve once and then looked away again. Tessa watched her sister, then looked back at Rhett. Where's the ranch? She said. It wasn't entirely a question. East Territory. The hardpan and rattlesnake land, she said. I imagine. You haven't seen it. No. She let out a slow breath. Something shifted in her expression. Not acceptance exactly, more like the recognition of a woman who has tallied the available options and found all of them inadequate and has decided to choose the least inadequate among them. Then I guess we find out together, she said. The ride out took most of the afternoon. Rhett's grulla mare was placid enough, though she had opinions about carrying 2 extra people on a pack horse that hadn't been broken for passengers. Tessa managed the animal through what appeared to be a combination of pressure and stubbornness. Lydia sat behind her with her hands loose at her sides and her eyes on the grass moving past. And somewhere around the second hour, the pack horse stopped fighting the arrangement. Nobody said much. Rhett was accustomed to silence and preferred it. Tessa seemed to be working something through in her mind, her posture forward and attentive even when there was nothing to be attentive to. Lydia watched the land. They made it to the property at dusk. It was not inspiring. The 40 acres stretched out in a rough rectangle between a line of cottonwood trees to the north and a broken fence line to the south. The soil was pale and thin in places, cracked where it had baked through the summer, though there were patches of darker earth near the cottonwoods that suggested something better underneath if you got past the surface. A structure occupied the northwest corner. Calling it a house was ambitious. It was 4 walls and a partial roof and a door that hung at an angle that made it impossible to close properly. Tessa got off the horse and walked to the doorway and stood there looking in. Then she came back out. There's a rat in there, she said. Just the one? Rhett said. That I could see in the dark. He dismounted and moved past her. The interior smelled like everything that had been left alone too long. Damp wood, animal residue, the particular mustiness of air that hadn't circulated properly in months. The roof had a gap along the east wall where light was still leaking through in the last of the evening. The floor was packed dirt. 2 wooden supports held up the ceiling, and one of them had developed a crack that he needed to look at more carefully in daylight. Not habitable, exactly, but not uncorrectable. He came back outside. Tessa was standing with her hands on her hips and that same expression she'd had at the auction. Practical, calculating, not yet defeated. We're sleeping out tonight, he said. I figured. I'll get a fire going. It gets cold out here after dark. She nodded. There's grass near those trees. I'll look for groundwater in the morning. He looked at her. You know how to find groundwater? My father did. I watched enough times to have the general idea. Lydia had wandered toward the fence line and was crouching in the grass, her hand extended toward something invisible in the fading light. As Rhett watched, she stayed perfectly still for almost a full minute. Then a small shape moved out of the grass and touched her hand. A rabbit. Wild, uninjured, unconcerned. It sniffed her fingers and sat there for several seconds before bounding away. Lydia stood and brushed her knees off and walked back toward the horses without comment. Rhett made the fire. He had flour and salt and a strip of dried meat in his pack, which he divided into 3 portions without ceremony. They ate in near silence beside the fire, the prairie dark and enormous around them, the cottonwoods moving in a light wind that came down from the north with a first edge of cold in it. Why did you do it? He looked up. Tessa was watching him across the fire, her tin cup held in both hands. Do what? Buy us. You didn't want to. Anyone looking at you could see that. You weren't planning it. She paused. Harlan was going to win that bid. Rhett poked the fire with a stick. A log shifted and sent up a brief column of sparks. I don't know, he said. It wasn't the answer she was looking for, and they both knew it, and he wasn't sure he had a better one. He'd been turning it over himself for the past 4 hours. Something about the way Tessa had found the speaker in the crowd and held him with her eyes for those 3 seconds. Something about Lydia and the crow. Something about Harlan's face when he'd said the word friend. None of it amounted to a reason a sensible person would respect. You spent everything you had, Tessa said. Yes. For strangers. Yes. She looked at him for another long moment, reading something in his face that he wasn't certain was there to be read. Then she looked down at her cup. You have a plan? She said. Some of one. That's not reassuring. No, he agreed. It isn't. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl announced itself twice and then went quiet. Lydia had lain down on her bedroll with her eyes open, watching the stars with the same unhurried attention she gave everything else. And after a while her breathing slowed and she was asleep. Tessa stayed up another hour. When she finally lay down, she said without turning toward him, If this turns into something else, if you turn out to be something different than what you said, then you walk, he said. Both of you. And I won't stop you. Silence. All right, she said. Rhett fed another branch into the fire and sat back on his heels and looked out at the dark prairie. The stars were the kind of thick and close you only got far from towns. The land was flat and empty and cracked in places, and the shack behind him had a rat in it and a roof with a gap and a door that didn't close. He had $0. He had a piece of land he'd never stood on before today, a ranch that existed only in the loosest sense of the word, and 2 strangers sleeping by his fire. In the morning he would have to figure out water, then food beyond what remained in his pack, then tools, materials, all of it requiring money he didn't have. There was a time in his life, before Denton, before the partnership that had turned into a lesson he still carried in his ribs like a badly healed fracture, when he might have found some rough pleasure in the magnitude of the problem. He didn't know if that version of himself was still in there somewhere, or if the last 2 years had used it up entirely. He supposed he'd find that out too. He stayed by the fire until it burned down low, watching the dark, listening to the wind move through the cottonwood leaves in long, slow sighs, and then he pulled his coat closer and let himself sleep. The first morning on the land was an education in how much they didn't know. Rhett was up before light, walking the fence line with a lantern that threw a pale circle of yellow across the ground ahead of him. The south boundary was worse than it had looked at dusk. Not just broken, but pulled apart in sections. Posts rotted to the point where they crumbled when he put weight against them. The north side, near the cottonwoods, held better. The trees had sheltered it from the worst of the wind, and the posts there still had some integrity. He marked the weak sections in his head and kept walking. By the time he got back to camp, Tessa was already up and 20 yards from the cottonwood line with a long stick, moving it slowly across the ground in a grid pattern with the concentration of someone doing arithmetic in their head. You're actually doing it, he said. Doing what? Looking for water. She didn't stop the pattern. My father always said to look where the land dips, even a little. Water follows gravity same as everything else. And those trees, cottonwoods, don't grow without water. It's close somewhere. How close? I'll let you know. He left her to it and turned his attention to the shack. The rat was still in residence, confirmed when it shot across the floor toward a gap in the south wall the moment he pushed the door open. The roof gap was along a 3-foot section where 2 boards had warped apart over what looked like more than one winter. The support post with the crack was worse than he'd estimated in the dark. It had split vertically for about 14 inches and was held together mostly by habit. He'd need to sister it before putting any real weight on the ceiling. He was still looking at it when Lydia appeared in the doorway. She studied the interior with her quiet, methodical attention, moving her eyes across the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the gap of morning sky visible through the roof. Then she walked to the corner where the rat had been, crouched, and looked at the gap in the wall. "It'll come back," she said. It was the first full sentence he'd heard from her. "Probably. Rats are territorial. They don't leave because they feel threatened. They leave when they can't come back." She looked at the gap with what appeared to be genuine consideration. "If you block that, he'll find another way in. You'd have to block everything at once." Rhett looked at her. "You know a lot about rats." "I know a lot about animals," she said simply, and walked back out into the morning. By midday, Tessa had found water. Not a spring exactly, but a seep about 40 feet north of the cottonwood line where the ground stayed dark and gave when you pushed at it. Rhett dug down 2 feet with the short-handled shovel from his pack and hit a layer of sand that was wet enough to pack. It would take a proper well before they could depend on it, and a well required tools and time they didn't currently have, but the water was there. "My father would have been pleased," Tessa said, watching him dig. Then, as if she'd said more than she intended, "He was wrong about a lot of things, but he knew land." Rhett didn't ask about the rest of it. It wasn't the moment, and he'd learned that the moments people chose to say things were usually the wrong times to ask questions. They spent the remainder of that first week in a state of controlled exhaustion. Rhett rode into Coldwater Crossing twice, once to arrange credit at the hardware merchant against the value of the land, which required a conversation that involved more persuasion than he was comfortable with, and once to collect the supplies that credit had produced. Lumber, nails, a proper shovel, a handsaw, enough flour and dried beans to last 3 weeks if they were careful. He came back each time to find that Tessa had not been idle. She had cleared the interior of the shack by the second day, dragging out the accumulated debris with a thoroughness that suggested she'd been making mental lists since the first night. She'd assessed the soil in 4 locations across the property, digging down to check composition at each point, and left small stakes where she'd made her assessments. When Rhett asked what she was looking at, she showed him without preamble. The darker patches near the cottonwoods had better topsoil, she said. Sandier than ideal, but workable. The southern half of the property was the problem. Too much clay. It would crack in summer and turn to something close to concrete. "What did you grow before?" he asked. "Our homestead was different land, better water table." She looked at the southern acres. "But I watched enough seasons to know what fights the soil and what works with it. Squash and beans don't mind clay as much as wheat does. If we put the grain crops north and the kitchen garden south—" "We don't have seed," he said. "Not yet." He did the arithmetic on what remained of his credit line and the cost of seed stock and came up short. He didn't tell her that. He said he'd work on it, and she gave him a look that said she understood the math without being told. The roof got fixed first because sleeping dry was not optional once the weather shifted. He and Tessa worked it together over 2 days while Lydia occupied herself at the fence line, and it was on the second afternoon while Rhett was on the roof and Tessa was passing boards up to him that she said, "You were in a partnership before. Somebody used you." He didn't answer immediately. A nail went in. Another. "What makes you say that?" "The way you watch people. Like you're waiting for them to show you what they actually want." She held up another board. "My father had that look after the bank took our northern fields. Took about a year before he stopped watching everyone like they were about to reach in his pocket." "Did it go away?" She was quiet for a second. "Mostly. Then it came back when the rest of the land went. After that, it just stayed." He took the board. My partner's name was Cal Denton. We'd run cattle together for 3 years. I put in everything I had: savings, the horses I'd bred, the equipment. He took buyers to the table without telling me, sold the operation for a number I never heard until after the papers were signed, and walked away with 60%. He drove the nail in. The contract had a clause I hadn't read closely enough. Legal. Completely legal. Did you go after him? I thought about it, long enough that it scared me. He paused. Then I decided that whatever I became going after him wasn't worth what I'd have to pay to get there. Tessa said nothing for a moment. Then, that sounds like it took a lot more self-control than it sounds. It really did, he said, and that was the end of it. The shack became livable by the end of the second week, not comfortable. The floor was still dirt, the door still required lifting slightly to close, and the single window on the west wall had no glass, only a piece of oiled cloth that let in light and kept out most of the wind. But the roof no longer leaked, and the cracked support post had been sistered with a new length of timber, and the rat, following Lydia's theory, had been discouraged from returning by the systematic blocking of every gap in the south wall simultaneously, which required an entire afternoon and produced in Lydia an expression of quiet satisfaction. What happened with the horses started almost by accident. There was a small band of Mustangs that ran the eastern edge of the territory, 5 of them, a stallion and 4 mares, that the neighboring ranchers had been trying to capture and run off for the better part of 2 seasons. Wild horses competed with cattle for grazing, and nobody in Coldwater Crossing had managed to get close enough to do anything about this particular group. They were skittish and fast, and the stallion had a temper that had left a man named Purdy with a broken forearm the previous spring. Lydia found them on a Thursday in the 3rd week when she'd wandered farther east than she was supposed to. She came back at dusk, later than Rhett was comfortable with, and when he met her at the fence line with a short sentence about the distance she'd covered, she looked at him with that focused attention and said, "There are horses about 2 miles east, 5 of them. The stallion has a wire cut on his left foreleg. It's not infected, but it will be." "How close did you get?" "Close enough to see the cut," which, with a Mustang stallion, should not have been possible. Rhett looked at her for a long moment. "What did you do?" "I just sat down," she said, "in the grass, and waited. They came to look at me eventually." He told her to stay away from them. She agreed in the tone of someone who intended to continue doing exactly what she'd been doing, and he knew it, and they both accepted the fiction. By the 5th week, she had fed the lead mare from her hand. Tessa watched all of this with an expression that moved between disbelief and something approaching awe. "She's always done this," she told Rhett one evening, "since she was small. Animals just don't treat her like they treat everyone else." "Does it worry you?" "The horses worry me. The stallion, he lets her near him?" Tessa looked at him. "He follows her." Rhett went east the next morning and watched from a rise, far enough back to avoid changing anything. Lydia was in the grass below, walking at the slow, directionless pace of someone who was not going anywhere in particular, and the 5 Mustangs were moving with her, not herded, not driven, just present, keeping about 30 feet of space that narrowed or widened with some intuition Rhett could not parse. He sat on that rise for a long time. The land was beginning to show the results of work. The north section had been turned and seeded, the seed purchased at a cost that had required Rhett to take a week's labor with a logging crew 20 miles south, work he hadn't mentioned to Tessa until he got back, which produced a brief and pointed argument about the difference between necessary decisions and ones that should be made together. He'd acknowledged she was right without much grace about it, and she'd moved on with the brisk efficiency of someone who didn't have time for grudges even when they were warranted. The kitchen garden in the south was a rougher enterprise. The clay soil fought every tool and baked hard between waterings, and their water supply, even with the well they dug in the 4th week, was careful work. But squash plants had taken hold in 2 rows with the stubborn tenacity of things that had decided to survive regardless of conditions, and there were bean plants putting out runners along the south fence. And Tessa spent an hour each morning working the beds with a focus that belonged to someone who understood that what went into the ground now was what stood between them and a hungry winter. They were not comfortable, they were not secure, but they were building, and building has its own momentum once it starts. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after the auction, in the form of a rider. Rhett was splitting fence posts near the south boundary when he heard the horse and looked up. The rider came across the open land from the west, not following any established trail, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who didn't consider it necessary to approach another person's property with any particular courtesy. He was a young man, 25 at most, with a clean shirt and a horse that cost more than anything on Rhett's entire property. He pulled up outside the fence line and looked at the garden, the shack, the new well housing, the repaired fence, with the expression of someone reviewing an unexpected complication. "You're Mercer," he said. "Not a question." "I am. I'm Cale Whitmore. I work for Warren Aldis." Rhett knew the name. Everybody in the territory knew the name. Aldis ran the largest cattle operation in the region. 11,000 acres, 3 line camps, contracts with 2 rail companies. He was not a man whose name appeared in casual conversation. When it appeared, it was usually attached to something that had already been decided. "What does Aldis want?" Rhett said. "He wants to talk to you about the eastern land, the 40 acres. "Talk about what?" Whitmore shifted in his saddle. "He's interested in making an offer. Fair market, maybe better. It's not for sale." Whitmore looked at the shack, the turned soil, the garden with its clay-fighting squash rows, and his face did something brief and involuntary that was not quite contempt, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Mr. Aldis figured you might say that. He also figured you might reconsider once you've had a full season out here." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "He asked me to leave this. His offer, in writing. No pressure." Rhett looked at the envelope but didn't move toward the fence to take it. "Leave it on the post," he said. Whitmore placed it on the fence post with the careful neutrality of someone filing a document. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, still unhurried. Tessa came out of the shack when the rider was 100 yards off. She'd been listening from the doorway. She looked at the envelope on the fence post. "Who's Aldis?" she said. "Cattle baron. East side of the territory mostly, but his grazing reaches north." Rhett picked up the envelope, didn't open it. "He's been buying up small homesteads for 3 years. Some sell. Some don't come to the decision entirely on their own." Tessa was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean?" "It means some of them had things happen to their property before they decided to sell." He set the envelope on the fence rail. "I'm not going to panic about one visit, but we need to be clear-eyed about what it might mean if this continues." She took the envelope, opened it, read what was inside. Her expression didn't change much, but something in her posture did. A tightening. The number written on the letter was low, lower than what the land was worth with a working well and turned soil, and the tone of it was the particular tone of an offer, written by someone who expected the recipient to feel grateful. "He thinks we're desperate," she said. "He thinks we don't have options," Rhett said, "which is not the same thing, but it's what he's working with." She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. "What do we do?" "We keep working," he said, "and we watch." What came next didn't come all at once. It came the way most trouble comes on the frontier, in pieces, spread far enough apart that you could almost convince yourself each incident was coincidence. First, the south fence posts along the shared boundary with the Aldis grazing corridor were found pulled from the ground one morning. Not broken, not wind damage, pulled cleanly and laid in the grass as though someone had done it methodically in the night. It took Rhett and Tessa most of a day to reset them. Then one of the squash rows collapsed overnight, the plants torn up at the roots. Not animal damage. The pattern was too regular, too deliberate. Then 3 of the bean rows went the same way. Then Rhett found tracks in the wet ground near the well. Boot prints, more than one set, facing the well housing and the garden both. He didn't say anything to Tessa immediately, which was a mistake, because she found the tracks herself an hour later and came to find him with a particular quality in her expression that was colder than anger. "You saw these," she said. "It wasn't a question. I was going to—" "Don't manage me," she said. "I'm not a child and I'm not your employee. If something's happening to this place, I need to know it when you know it." He absorbed that. "You're right. I'm sorry." She didn't soften immediately, but she moved on. "How many times?" "The fence was first, then the garden. 3 incidents." She looked at the tracks. That's not random. No, it isn't. Aldous. Most likely his crew, maybe Whitmore. I can't prove any of it. Tessa looked out across the land they'd spent 6 weeks building from nothing. The well housing, the garden rows that were still intact, the repaired fence, the shack with its fixed roof and its blocked rat gaps. All of it assembled from practically zero, with 2 people who hadn't known each other 6 weeks ago and 1 girl who talked to horses. Her jaw worked for a moment. Then we build faster, she said. It was not the most strategic response, and they both knew it. But it was the only one that made sense to either of them in that moment. The instinct that had been building since the first morning on this land, since Rhett had sat on his heels by a dying fire and looked out at 40 acres of nothing and thought about what it would cost to make it something. You build faster, you hold tighter, you don't give the thing you're afraid of the satisfaction of looking back and seeing you move. The horses were the part of the picture that neither of them had planned for. By the end of the second month, Lydia had established something with the Mustang band that Rhett had no clean word for. She'd been spending 2 or 3 hours each evening out on the eastern grass, and the horses had stopped keeping 30 feet between themselves and her. The stallion in particular, the one with the wire cut that had healed cleaner than anyone would have predicted, possibly because Lydia had gotten close enough to clean it with water and cloth on 3 separate occasions, had begun to respond to her in ways that experienced horse handlers sometimes spent years trying to achieve. He didn't submit to her exactly. It was more like an agreement. Tessa watched her sister come back from one of those sessions and said quietly to Rhett, "If she can actually train them, I know. Wild horses that nobody else has been able to touch. I know." She looked at him. "That's something Aldous can't buy away from us." He didn't answer that, but he thought about it for a long time after she'd gone inside. The Whitmore visit had not been repeated, but the sabotage had continued in small ways. A water trough disrupted, a section of new fence tampered with overnight. Each incident careful enough to be deniable, each one a message dressed up as an accident. Aldous was patient. He had 11,000 acres and rail contracts and 7 years of experience taking what he wanted from people who didn't have enough to fight back with. He was waiting for them to exhaust themselves, or frighten themselves, or simply do the arithmetic on how long a well and a vegetable garden could sustain 3 people against a man who could afford to be inconvenient indefinitely. What Aldous hadn't counted on was what was happening out on the eastern grass each evening when the light went low and the temperature dropped, and Lydia Hale walked out into the wild with her quiet hands and her unhurried patience. He hadn't counted on any of it, really. Neither, if Rhett was being honest with himself, had Rhett. The crops were gone by the first week of October. Rhett found them at dawn, or what remained of them. The north section, where the grain had been coming in with the kind of slow, grudging progress that felt like a personal argument between the seed and the soil, had been driven through overnight by horses. Not wild horses. Shod horses, 4 or 5 of them, moving back and forth across the rows in the dark, with enough passes to churn the young plants into the ground completely. The bean rows along the south fence were gone too, the wire pulled down again, and the plants themselves dragged out and left in a heap at the edge of the property line, like a deliberate punctuation mark. He stood in the ruined north field for a long time, without moving. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of October cold that came in off the ridge and settled low over the land and made everything feel heavier than it was. The hoofprints in the dark soil overlapped each other in a pattern that was almost methodical, back and forth, covering the length of the planted rows with a thoroughness that would have required time and intention. Tessa came out at first light. She didn't say anything when she saw it. She walked the north section slowly, the same way she'd walked it when she was planting, and Rhett watched her stop at the far end and stand with her back to him for almost a full minute. When she turned around, her face was careful and contained in the way of someone who has decided that a visible reaction would cost more than they're willing to spend. "How many horses?" she said. 4, maybe 5. Shod. Aldous. "Yes." She came back toward him across the ruined ground, stepping over the churned rows. "The squash?" "Whatever was left in the south. Gone." She stopped in front of him. The careful expression held, but something behind it was working. "We can't replant, not with winter coming. There's nothing that will mature before the frost. She looked at him. We're going to run short on food by January, maybe sooner. I know. The well is still good, the structure's intact, but without the harvest. I know, Tessa. She pressed her lips together, looked at the field, looked at him again. What do we do? It was the same question she'd asked him after Whitmore's visit, and he hadn't had a fully satisfying answer then either. But something had been forming in the back of his mind for the past several weeks. Not a plan exactly, more like a set of pieces that he'd been trying to figure out how to arrange. The destruction of the crops made the question urgent in a way it hadn't been before. There's a livestock competition, he said. Ridgeline Fair, second week of November, over in Hatcher's Crossing. She looked at him. I know about Ridgeline. Every rancher in the territory goes. Prize money for the horse categories. Best working horse, best trained, best untouched. There's a class for horses taken from wild stock and brought to competition standard in a single season. The purse for that class is $240. Tessa was very still. You're talking about Lydia's horses. I'm talking about the best horse from Lydia's horses. The stallion. He's not tame. He's not tame the way most horses aren't tame, Rhett said. What he is with Lydia is something different. She turned and looked east, reflexively, toward the grass where Lydia spent her evenings. The horizon was pale and featureless in the early light. She's 12 years old, Tessa said. She's 11. She's a child. She's the only person in this territory who can walk up to that stallion and put a hand on him without getting kicked into next week. He kept his voice even. I'm not asking her to do something dangerous. I'm asking if you think she can do what she's been doing in front of people. Tessa didn't answer immediately. She was doing the things she did when she was working through something honestly, not performing consideration, actually doing it, going through the picture from every angle. She'd have to register, she said finally. There'd be judges, crowd noise, strange horses. Yes, that stallion has never been in a crowd. No. If he spooks, she could get hurt. She could, he agreed, which is why I'm asking you, not deciding it myself. That landed differently than he expected. She looked at him with a brief, almost surprised expression, as if she hadn't anticipated him putting it in her hands. Then she looked east again. I'll talk to her, Tessa said. Lydia's response, when Tessa laid it out that evening by the fire, was to listen to all of it without interruption and then say, He'll be all right in a crowd if I'm with him. He doesn't trust the noise. He trusts me. You don't know that for certain, Tessa said. I know him. Lydia looked at her hands. He's been in worse things than a crowd. When we found him, he had a wire cut on his leg and the whole band was running from something. Whatever he came from was worse than a fairground. She paused. I can do it. Tessa looked at Rhett. He said nothing. All right, Tessa said at last. But I need you to promise me something. Lydia looked up. If at any point he feels wrong to you, if you feel him change, you get clear. You don't try to hold him. You let go and you get away from him. Promise me that. I promise, Lydia said. It was said with the simple directness of someone who meant it, and Tessa accepted it the same way. And that was the end of that part of the conversation. But that wasn't the full plan, and Rhett knew it, because $240 solved the food problem and perhaps the winter, and nothing beyond that. It didn't solve Aldous. He was still working that part when Tessa came to find him the next morning. She'd been in Coldwater Crossing the previous afternoon, and she laid what she'd gathered on the table with the organized efficiency of someone who'd been collecting pieces without knowing what she was building toward. You know, the Aldous land grab started 3 years ago, she said. 7 homesteads in the Eastern Territory. 5 of them sold. 2 of them, she paused, had accidents before they sold. Fence fires. A well collapse that the county recorded as natural deterioration. Rhett looked at the papers she'd brought. Where did you get these? County Records Office. They're public documents. Anyone can ask for them. She set a finger on one page. This one, the Kessler Homestead, northeast of us, sold to an Aldous holding company for a number that doesn't make sense. The property was worth 3 times what they got, but the sale went through a man named Holt, who operates a land brokerage in Hatcher's Crossing. Same man filed the documentation on 2 of the other properties. Rhett looked at the name. You think Holt is how Aldous covers himself? I think Aldous doesn't do his own paperwork because he doesn't have to. Holt does it. And if those land valuations were falsified, if those families were sold a number that was deliberately wrong, that's fraud. Not just bad dealing, legal fraud. Rhett was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since the second time someone pulled up our fence posts, she said. I grew up watching my father lose land because he didn't know what questions to ask or who to ask them to. I decided a long time ago I'd learn enough to ask the right ones. She looked at him steadily. There's going to be a lot of ranchers at Ridgeline Fair, people who lost land, people who sold for less than they should have, people who know each other and talk. You want to bring this to the fair. I want to bring the documents to the fair. Let people see what I found. Let them look at their own transactions against what the county records show and draw their own conclusions. She paused. If 10 people start asking the same questions at the same time, in the same place, in front of everyone, it doesn't prove anything legally, he said. Not immediately, but it makes Aldous visible in a way he hasn't been. He operates because nobody's looking at the whole picture at once. They're each only seeing their own piece. She gathered the papers into a careful stack. I want to show people the whole picture. He looked at her for a long moment. This was the woman who'd stood on a platform at a frontier auction and spent 3 seconds locating the man who'd laughed at her, who'd memorized her father's methods of finding water and tested them alone on the first morning on new land, who'd argued with him about decision-making and been right about it and moved on without gloating. It's a risk, he said. If Aldous finds out what you're doing before you've shown people, he won't find out. If he does, then we're in the same position we're already in, she said. Except we tried something. She held his gaze. We can't just keep repairing fence posts, Rhett. He didn't have an argument against that, because she was correct. All right, he said. Ridgeline Fair. Both plans, same day. What followed was 2 weeks of preparation that Rhett would later remember as one of the more clarifying periods of his adult life, because it stripped everything down to the essential question of what 3 people could accomplish working in absolute alignment with each other. Lydia worked the stallion every day. She had named him Cutter for the wire scar on his foreleg, and Cutter responded to the name with the animal equivalent of tolerance. He didn't come to it, but he oriented to the sound of her voice in a way that was functionally similar. She began introducing him to noise. She'd bang a tin pail at a distance and reward his stillness. She walked him in wider arcs that brought him closer to the road where wagon traffic occasionally passed. The first time a freight wagon came by at speed, Cutter wheeled, and she let him go 10 feet before he stopped himself, turned back, and looked at her. That look, the checking-in quality of it, was something Rhett observed from a rise and couldn't fully articulate afterward. It was as if the horse had decided that her steadiness was information he could use. She also began working 2 of the mares. Not for the competition entry was Cutter, but because the mares needed handling too, and because Lydia seemed constitutionally unable to be near an animal that needed something without attending to it. Tessa refined her documents. She went back to the records office twice more and found additional filings that matched her pattern, and she organized everything in a sequence that a person encountering it for the first time could follow without explanation. She was also, quietly, making contact. She didn't announce what she was doing, but Rhett noticed the frequency of her trips to town, and on the 3rd one he went with her and watched her spend 40 minutes in conversation with a woman named Clara Vesper, whose husband had sold their homestead to an Aldous holding company 18 months ago and moved to a rented property south of Coldwater Crossing. He watched Clara Vesper's expression change as Tessa showed her documents. Not dramatically, it was the expression of someone having confirmed what they'd already half suspected, which is a different and quieter thing than surprise. Clara Vesper knew 2 other families. Clara Vesper would make sure they came to Ridgeline Fair. What Aldous was doing in those 2 weeks, Rhett learned about later. The Baron had a man watching the Mercer property. That much became clear from the fact that on the 4th day of their preparations, Whitmore reappeared, not at the fence line this time, but at the front of the shack, riding up without announcement at mid-morning while Tessa was in town and Rhett was working near the well. Whitmore sat his expensive horse and looked at the repaired fence, the well housing, the evidence of activity with the kind of careful attention that wasn't casual. "Mr. Aldous has increased his offer," he said, and named a number that was better than the first letter, but still not what the land was worth with water and worked soil. "No," Rhett said. "He thought you might say that." Whitmore looked at the eastern grass without expression. "He also wanted me to mention that the Ridgeline Fair registration deadline has passed for the livestock competition." Rhett kept his face neutral. "Has it?" "Closed last Friday." Whitmore's tone was the same careful nothing it always was. "Thought you'd want to know." He rode off. Rhett went directly to his coat and pulled out the registration confirmation he'd sent by post 3 weeks ago and received back 10 days later. Entry confirmed for Ridgeline Fair livestock competition, wild stock class, handler L. Hale. He looked at it for a long moment. Aldous knew about the horse, or suspected. He'd tried to cut it off through the registration, which meant either he'd put pressure on the fair organization, or he'd lied to Whitmore about the deadline, or Whitmore had lied to Rhett. In any of those versions, someone had been watching closely enough to know what they were planning. That evening he told Tessa and Lydia about the visit. Lydia listened with her characteristic stillness. "He's afraid of Cutter," she said. "He's afraid of the money we'd win," Tessa said. "No." Lydia shook her head slowly. "He's afraid of what it means if a wild horse that nobody could touch is standing in front of everyone and I'm the one handling him. He's afraid of what people will think about us after that." She said this without any visible satisfaction in it, just the observational clarity that was simply how her mind worked. "He doesn't want people to see us as worth defending." Rhett and Tessa looked at each other. The girl was right. The morning they left for Ridgeline Fair was cold, the sky hammered flat and pale, the kind of November morning where the frost didn't lift until midday. Rhett drove the wagon with Tessa beside him and Lydia in the back with Cutter on a lead rope. The stallion walking beside the wagon rather than loaded in it, because loading him would have been a fight nobody needed 2 hours before a competition. They were 3 miles out when Rhett heard the horses behind them. He didn't turn immediately. He measured the sound. Multiple animals, moving faster than trail pace, gaining. Then he looked back. 4 riders. He didn't recognize all of them, but he recognized the shape of the situation immediately. The spacing between them, the angle of approach, the fact that they weren't on the road but coming across open ground to intercept. "Tessa," he said. She'd already seen them. Her hand had moved to the side of the wagon bench where he kept a rifle in a scabbard bolted to the boards. "Don't," he said. "Not yet." The riders came up fast and pulled around to block the road ahead. The lead man was someone Rhett had seen at Aldis's fence line before, but never spoken to. Mid-40s, heavy, through the shoulders, wearing the expression of a man performing an unpleasant duty he'd been assigned rather than one he'd chosen. "Mercer," he said. "Turn around." Rhett stopped the wagon. Cutter snorted behind him, and he heard Lydia's voice, low and steady, not words exactly, just tone. The particular sound she made that told the stallion the situation was being managed. "On whose authority?" Rhett said. "Mr. Aldous has a concern about the road. Maintenance issue. It's closed." "It's a public road." "It's closed today," Tessa said very quietly to Rhett. 3 hours until the competition opens." He looked at the 4 riders. The man who'd spoken had a rifle across his saddle, not raised, just present. The 2 on the left were younger and trying to look settled and not quite managing it. The one on the far right was older and not trying to look like anything at all, which was the one Rhett was most concerned about. "You're going to let us pass," Rhett said. His voice had the same flat quality it had when he told Harlan at the auction that he wasn't his friend. Not elevated, not sharpened, just precise. "I'm not," the lead man said. "If you put a hand on this wagon," Rhett said, "you'll be doing it in front of 2 witnesses, in daylight, on a public road, on the morning of the largest gathering of ranchers in this territory. And Tessa will know every family name at that fair and which ones have a reason to be interested in what happens here." He paused. "You can ride back and tell Aldous you stopped us, and then you can explain to him what the consequence of that will be when 60 people who already distrust him hear about it this afternoon." The lead man's expression didn't change, but something behind it recalculated. The older rider on the far right said nothing at all. He just turned his horse slowly and walked it off the road into the grass, which was not following orders but was also not standing in the way anymore, which was a different and important thing. The three remaining riders looked at their lead man. He held the position for another 10 seconds. Then he moved his horse to the side of the road. Rhett clicked the team forward and they rolled past without hurrying. He kept his hands easy on the reins and his eyes forward, and he was aware of Tessa doing the same, and of Lydia in the back maintaining her low, steady presence beside Cutter, who had felt the tension in the air and was walking close to the wagon with his neck slightly arched. Not panicking, just alert, the way an animal is alert when it has decided to trust the person beside it rather than its own instincts. Rhett didn't release the breath he'd been holding until they were a quarter-mile clear. "They'll send word ahead," Tessa said. "Yes. Aldous will be at the fair. He's always at Ridgeline. He enters cattle every year." Rhett looked at the road ahead. "We knew he'd be there." "Are you worried?" He thought about it honestly. "Some," he said. "Good," she said. "The times I've stopped being worried are the times I've made my worst decisions." Ridgeline Fair occupied a flat area of ground outside Hatcher's Crossing that transformed twice a year into something approaching a small city. By the time the Mercer wagon arrived, the livestock pens were already filling, and the smell of animals and wood smoke and fry bread hit them from a quarter-mile out. Voices and wagon wheels and the complaint of penned cattle layered over each other into the thick generative noise of a frontier gathering. Lydia stood up in the wagon bed when they came over the rise and saw all of it. Cutter moved closer to her, his shoulder against the sideboard, and she put her hand on his neck without looking at him. "It's loud," she said. "Yes," Rhett said. "He'll be all right." She said it with the particular conviction of someone who had already decided on the outcome and was working backward from it. They registered at the livestock tent, where the official confirmed their entry with brisk efficiency and a sideways look at Cutter that suggested the man had opinions about wild stock and competition, but was keeping them to himself. The wild stock class was scheduled for 2 o'clock. It was 9:30 in the morning. Tessa was gone within 20 minutes of their arrival. She moved through the fairground the way she moved through most situations, with a directional certainty that didn't invite questions. Rhett saw her find Clara Vesper near the Eastern food stalls, and he saw Clara Vesper move off immediately to find someone else. And he understood that whatever network Tessa had been building over the past 2 weeks was now being activated. He stayed with Lydia and worked the morning in concentric circles, walking Cutter along the fair's outer edge where the noise was present but manageable, letting the stallion take it in at a distance before bringing him slightly closer. Cutter was not relaxed. He was too intelligent for false relaxation, too aware of the unfamiliar. But he was controlled. He held himself with a taut, watchful quality and kept his attention on Lydia the way a compass needle holds north. A boy of about 8 came too close at 11 o'clock, running without watching where he was going and pulling up short about 6 feet from Cutter's head. Cutter threw his head up and back 2 steps, and Lydia moved in front of him immediately, not between him and the boy as a shield, but facing Cutter directly, her hand on his jaw, her voice in that wordless register. He came down in a matter of seconds. The boy's mother grabbed her son and apologized profusely, and Lydia said it was fine, quietly, her attention still on the horse. "She's something," a man behind Rhett said. He turned. The speaker was a rancher he didn't know, weathered and mid-50s, watching Lydia with genuine interest. "I've been handling horses 40 years, the man continued. "I've seen maybe 2 people with that kind of touch." He nodded at the stallion. "Where'd she learn it?" "She didn't," Rhett said. "She just is." At noon, Tessa found him near the water trough at the north end of the grounds. She was carrying her document folder, and her expression had the look of someone who had done more in 3 hours than most people do in a week. 11 families, she said quietly. 3 of them have documents of their own they'd forgotten they kept. Clara's husband has correspondence from Holt that contradicts the official county filing by almost $2,000. Who else? There's a woman named Margaret Oakes whose husband sold to an Aldous holding company last spring. She didn't know about the holding company structure, so she thought she was selling to a private buyer. When I showed her the chain of ownership documents from the county records, Tessa paused. She started crying. Not sad crying, the other kind. Rhett understood. The kind of crying that comes when you finally have the name of a thing you've been carrying without being able to name it. Aldous is here, Tessa continued. I saw him near the cattle pens. He has Whitmore with him and 2 other men I don't know. Has he seen you? I don't think so, not yet. Rhett looked across the fairground at the afternoon crowd, the livestock pens, the flags marking the competition area where the wild stock class would begin at 2 o'clock. He thought about the 4 riders on the road that morning. He thought about the ruined north field at dawn, the hoof prints crossing the crop rows back and forth with their patient, methodical destruction. He thought about Tessa at the county records office, going back twice, learning to ask the right questions. He thought about Lydia in the grass at dusk, and a stallion that had decided she was information he could trust. After the competitions, he said, whatever happens with Cutter, after that, when people are still together, when there's still a crowd, that's when you show them. Tessa nodded. I know. It's going to get loud. It was always going to get loud, she said. At 5 minutes to 2, Lydia led Cutter into the competition area, and the crowd that had gathered for the wild stock class went quiet in the particular way crowds go quiet when they see something they weren't expecting. The stallion moved beside her with his head up and his scar-marked foreleg catching the pale November light. And if the noise of the fairground registered on him as something threatening, you could not have told it from watching him walk. He watched everything. He watched it the way Lydia watched things, all with full attention, steadily, without panic. She was 11 years old, and she walked into the center of that ring as though she had done it 100 times. Behind the rail, Rhett stood with his arms folded and watched, and felt something move through him that he didn't have a name for, and was not going to look at too directly, because some things are easier to carry if you don't examine them in the light. Warren Aldous was standing 40 feet away on the other side of the ring. He was watching Lydia and Cutter with an expression that had gone flat, in a way that was different from his usual controlled manner. It was the expression of a man who has executed a plan and is watching it fail in real time, and knows it, and has not yet decided what to do about that knowledge. His eyes moved from the ring to the crowd around it, to the people watching, to the quality of the watching. Not entertainment, something more invested than that, something personal. Then his eyes found Tessa, who was standing near the east rail with her document folder and with Clara Vesper beside her and 2 other people Rhett didn't know. Aldous looked at what Tessa was holding. His expression didn't change, but something did. The competition judge raised his flag, and Lydia took Cutter through his first pass, and the crowd's silence broke open into something that was not quite a cheer but was moving toward one. And beside the east rail, Tessa opened her folder and began to speak to the people around her in a clear, carrying voice. And across the ring, Warren Aldous stood very still in the November cold, and understood that the morning had arrived at a destination he had not planned for. And that was when everything came apart at once. The thing about a crowd that has started paying attention is that it doesn't stop easily. Tessa's voice carried in the cold November air with the clean, unhurried quality of someone who had rehearsed this moment, not in front of a mirror but in the practical theater of her own mind, running through it enough times that the words came out shaped rather than improvised. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. The people nearest to her leaned in, and the people behind them leaned in because the people in front had, and within 2 minutes she had a ring of 30 around her that was still growing at the edges. The Kessler property sold for $420, she said, holding up a county record sheet so the people closest could see the number. The county assessment at the time of sale valued it at $1,280. Same assessor, same year. The sale went through a land brokerage run by a man named Edmund Holt. She turned to the next page. The Brower Homestead. Sale price, $310. County assessment, $940. Same brokerage, same broker's signature. A man near the back said, I sold through Holt. Tessa found his face in the crowd. What was your sale price? A pause. $280. Do you know what your property was assessed at by the county that same year? He didn't, but 3 people around him were already looking at each other with the expression of people making rapid and unpleasant calculations. Across the competition ring, Rhett watched all of this in his peripheral vision, while keeping his primary attention on the situation developing in the center of the fairground. Because while Tessa was producing documents and Lydia was working Cutter through his second pass before the judges, Warren Aldous had made a decision. Rhett saw it happen, saw Aldous say something to Whitmore, saw Whitmore move, and the two men with him move, all three of them separating and heading in different directions with the practiced spacing of people executing a plan that had been held in reserve for exactly this kind of contingency. Whitmore was heading toward Tessa. Rhett moved. He didn't run. Running across a fairground draws attention in ways that complicate whatever comes next. He walked fast, cutting between two livestock pens, stepping around a woman with a food basket who said something sharp at his back that he didn't catch. He came up between Whitmore and the edge of Tessa's crowd at roughly the same moment Whitmore reached it. Whitmore looked at him. Something in Whitmore's expression shifted. Not fear. The man wasn't built for fear, but a recalibration. He'd expected to reach Tessa in open space. He hadn't expected Rhett. "Move aside," Whitmore said quietly. "No," Rhett said. Same quiet. "This isn't your business. She's on my property agreement. That makes everything she does my business." He looked at Whitmore steadily. "We're standing in the middle of the largest gathering of ranchers in this territory, Cale. What exactly were you planning to do?" Whitmore's jaw tightened. He was a man accustomed to operating in the space between what was technically legal and what was merely understood to be permitted by the presence of Warren Aldis's name behind him. That space didn't exist here in the same way. There were too many people, too many eyes, too many individuals who had just heard Tessa Hale read county assessment records aloud and were now doing arithmetic. He stepped back, not retreat. He positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, watching, his hand resting on his belt with a deliberate casualness that Rhett clocked and kept in his awareness. The second of Aldis's men had gone toward the judge's area. Rhett couldn't track him without losing sight of Whitmore, so he held his position and trusted that what was happening in the competition ring would hold. It held. Lydia brought Cutter through his third pass, and the horse moved with the particular controlled energy of an animal that has agreed to the situation without being broken by it. His head was up, his movement clean, and the scar on his foreleg caught the light in a way that several people in the crowd pointed at and commented on. Because a wire-scarred Mustang moving in voluntary partnership with an 11-year-old girl was a thing that registered on people, that landed in some fundamental place where they kept their notions about what was possible. The judge at the north end of the ring wrote something on his board. Then Aldis himself came through the crowd toward Tessa. Rhett saw him coming from 20 feet out and understood immediately that this was the version of Warren Aldis that didn't send proxies, the version that had built 11,000 acres and rail contracts through the accumulated weight of his own physical presence in rooms where decisions were being made. He was a large man, not heavy but substantial, with the kind of face that had learned to do its work without expression. The crowd around Tessa opened for him automatically, the way crowds open for men who have practiced moving through them with authority. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the papers in her hands. Then he looked at her. "Miss Hale," he said, "I'd like to speak with you privately." "I'm speaking publicly at the moment," she said. "This isn't the place for—" "I think it's exactly the place," she said. She held up the document she'd been showing the crowd. "Mr. Aldis, are you familiar with the Holt Land Brokerage in Hatcher's Crossing?" A silence in the immediate crowd. The particular silence of people who have been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for a question like this to be asked in a room, or in this case, a fairground, where it had never been asked before. Aldis looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. "I use various brokerages for land acquisition," he said. "That's standard practice." Edmund Holt handled 7 property sales in the Eastern Territory over 3 years. All 7 sold to holding companies that trace back through county registry records to your operation. She turned the page. In 5 of those 7 cases, the sale price was between 30 and 40% of the county assessment value for that year. The families who sold received significantly less than what the land was legally worth. She paused. "Did you know the assessment values at the time of those purchases?" Aldis looked at the crowd. He was doing what powerful men do in moments of unexpected public exposure, assessing, calculating, deciding how much of the situation could still be controlled by the right application of his weight. "Land values are negotiated between willing parties," he said. "Whatever was agreed to." "The Brower family wasn't a willing party," said a man to Tessa's left. He was compact and gray-haired and spoke without heat, but with a precision that suggested he'd been waiting for an opportunity to say this specific thing for some time. Henry Brower died 8 months after that sale. His wife has been living on her daughter's floor in Coldwater Crossing since then. The money ran out in 7 months. He looked at Aldous directly. Were you aware of the assessment value when you made that offer? I wasn't involved in the individual. Your signature's on the holding company registration, Tessa said, and held up the page. The crowd had grown. Rhett could feel it without counting. The density had changed, the quality of the attention had changed. People were no longer drifting past and pausing. They had stopped moving entirely and were facing inward. Aldous's expression had arrived at something that was not quite controlled. It was controlled in the way a fire is controlled when you've poured water on it and the wood is still smoking. Not out, just suppressed. I'll be consulting with legal counsel, he said. His voice had flattened. Anyone making claims against my business interests will need to demonstrate them through proper channels. That's fair, Tessa said. I've already sent copies of these documents to the county recorder's office and to the circuit judge in Mill Haven. She said it without triumph, just information, the way you state a fact that has already landed. But I thought the people here deserved to see them first. Aldous looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the crowd. He looked at the faces around him, people who ran homesteads and cattle operations, people who used brokerages and borrowed against land assessments and depended on the county records being honest, people who were doing the arithmetic right now and finding that the numbers produced an answer they recognized. He turned and walked back through the crowd, and this time the crowd opened for him differently. Not with deference, but with the pointed, deliberate parting of people who are making a statement by the way they move. Whitmore fell in behind him. The other two men materialized from their separate positions. All four of them walked toward the Aldous cattle pens at the far end of the fairground with the contained urgency of people in a conversation that was not going to be productive. Rhett let out a breath. Clara Vesper appeared at his elbow. Is it enough? She said quietly. The documents. Is it enough to actually do something? Legally, it takes time, he said. But what just happened? 60 people hearing it at once, in public. That changes what Aldous can do next. He can't make this quiet again. It's already in too many ears. Clara nodded slowly. Then she turned back toward Tessa, who was still answering questions, still holding papers out for people to examine, still doing it with the same steady clarity she'd brought to every task since the first morning on this land, when she'd walked the field with a stick looking for water. The competition judge's flag went up at the north end of the ring. Rhett turned. Lydia was standing in the center of the ring with Cutter beside her, and the judge was walking toward her with the measured pace of an official performing a determination that has already been made. He stopped in front of her and said something Rhett couldn't hear from this distance. Then he held up a ribbon, dark blue, the color of the first place category, and the crowd at the ring rail broke into something that was unambiguously a cheer. Lydia accepted the ribbon with both hands and looked at it with the expression she gave most things, complete, present, without performance. Then she looked up and found Rhett's face in the crowd across the ring, and something in her expression shifted into something quieter and more private, the way a child's face changes when they look at the person they trust most in the room. He raised a hand. She nodded once, the same way Tessa nodded. Economical, sufficient. The $240 changed hands at the registration tent 40 minutes later. Rhett held the envelope for a moment before putting it in his coat. It was more money than he'd had since before Denton, and it solved the immediate problem. Food through winter, seed stock for spring, the tools they'd been doing without. It didn't solve everything. The sabotage of the crops was a loss they'd carry into the next growing season regardless. The ranch would be tight for a long time. But it was a floor, a real one, not the fiction of one. The afternoon moved in the way that afternoons move at frontier fairs after something significant has happened. The surface continued. People ate and traded and examined livestock. But underneath it all, there was a current of conversation that ran through every cluster of ranchers and homesteaders on the grounds. Rhett caught fragments of it as he moved. Names: Holt, Aldous, the holding company, the Brower family, the Kessler property. Numbers. Questions about assessment values and sale documentation. The careful, muttering arithmetic of people who had been doing business in good faith with a system they were only now beginning to look at directly. He found Tessa at the food stalls at 3:30, sitting on a bench with her document folder on her knees and a tin cup of coffee going cold in her hand. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been performing capability for an extended period and has finally been allowed to stop. He sat beside her, didn't say anything for a moment. "How many people talked to you?" he said. "Lost count after 20. She drank the cold coffee without reacting to the temperature. "There's a man named Garrett who has correspondence from Holt that directly contradicts the county filing. He kept it because something felt wrong at the time and he couldn't say what." She paused. "He said he'd been telling himself for 2 years that he must have misread it." "People do that," Rhett said, "when the alternative is admitting they were taken." "I know." She looked at the fairground around them. "The circuit judge in Mill Haven, the copies I sent. A man named Vickers who knows the judge told me this afternoon that he'll take it, that it's enough to open an inquiry." "An inquiry isn't a conviction." "No, but it's a light." She looked at him sideways. "Once there's a formal inquiry, Aldous can't operate the same way. He can't make quiet offers on land and expect people to accept without asking questions. The whole machinery of it depends on nobody looking at the whole picture." "You made them look." "We made them look," she said. The trouble came at dusk, which was when Rhett had expected it. They were loading the wagon at the north edge of the fairground, Lydia settling Cutter on the lead rope, Rhett stowing the supply purchases he'd made with part of the prize money, Tessa folding her document folder into the lockbox under the wagon seat, when he heard the footsteps and looked up. 4 men. Not Whitmore this time, not anyone in Aldis's usual orbit. These were harder men, rougher through the face, wearing clothes that weren't local. The kind of men who were hired for situations that required a different vocabulary than Whitmore's polished neutrality. The one in front stopped 6 feet from the wagon. "Mercer, you're coming with us." "Where?" Rhett said. "Mr. Aldis wants a word." Rhett looked at the 4 of them. He looked at Tessa, who had straightened beside the wagon seat without reaching for anything, her eyes moving across the 4 men with the same cataloging attention she'd turned on the crowd at the auction months ago. He looked at Lydia, who had her hand on Cutter's neck, and was watching the men with a stillness that was different from her usual stillness. This one had a coiled quality. "Tell Mr. Aldis," Rhett said, "that if he wants a conversation, he can have it in public, in front of people." "That's not—" "Tell him I'll be at the main gate for the next 20 minutes. After that, I'm on the road home." The man's jaw worked. He looked at his companions, then back at Rhett. "You're making a mistake." "I've made bigger ones," Rhett said, "and I'm still here." The man held the position for another moment, then turned and walked back into the dimming fairground. The other 3 followed. Tessa released a breath through her nose. "He's not going to come to the main gate." "No," Rhett said, "but they'll need to go back and report, and that buys us time to get on the road." They were moving within 5 minutes. The wagon rolled north under a sky that had gone purple and dark at the edges. The prize money in Rhett's coat, the document copies in the lockbox. Cutter pacing beside the wagon in the steady way he'd adopted since Lydia had asked him to walk rather than run. 3 miles from Hatcher's Crossing, in the same stretch of open road where they'd been blocked that morning, they heard the horses again. This time it was different. More of them, and coming faster, and from 2 directions at once, ahead from the north and behind from the south, which meant it had been arranged in advance, which meant Aldis had been planning this contingency while the fair was still running. "Lydia," Rhett said. "Into the wagon. Now." She was up and in before he finished the sentence, and Cutter came with her, his lead rope going taut, and Rhett locked the brake and stood up on the wagon bench to see better in the failing light. 6 riders from the north, 3 from the south. 9 total. Not Whitmore, none of Aldis's known crew. These were the men from the fairground, plus others he hadn't seen before. Tessa had the rifle out of the scabbard. "Don't fire unless they fire first," he said. "I wasn't planning to fire at all," she said. "I was planning to make them think about what happens if they do." The North Riders pulled up 40 feet ahead of the wagon. Their leader, a different man from the fairground, older, with the flat professional manner of someone who did this for money rather than loyalty, called out, "We need the document folder, Mercer. Give it over and you go home clean." "The originals are in the county record office," Rhett called back. "They've been there since last week. What's in that box is copies." A pause. The man hadn't known that. Rhett could see him reassessing. "Give us the copies," he said. "No." "Then we take them." What happened next was not clean or well organized, because things like this never are. The North Riders moved forward and Tessa stood up on the bench beside Rhett and leveled the rifle at the sky and fired once, not at anyone, into the air. And the sound of it in the cold night air rolled out across the open land in every direction and did what it was intended to do. Cutter erupted. Not at Lydia. He wheeled away from her, which was what she'd prepared him for, the exact response she'd trained him toward in all those evenings in the grass with the tin pail. He went sideways off the lead rope, which Lydia released on purpose, and he moved into the North Riders with his full mass and velocity and the particular fury of a wild horse that has decided the situation no longer qualifies as agreed upon. The North group scattered. Not all of them. 2 held their horses with skill, but the middle of their formation broke apart in a chaos of shying animals and confused movement, and in that gap Rhett drove the wagon team forward hard, north along the road, through the space where 6 riders had been 30 seconds ago. The wagon lurched over rough ground at the road's edge as they pushed through. Tessa held the bench rail with one hand and the rifle with the other. Lydia was flat in the wagon bed, low and calm, her voice still making that sound. Behind them, they heard the 3 Southern riders coming up fast. One of them gained on the wagon's right side, pulling close, and his hand came out toward the wagon's sideboard. Tessa turned and swung the rifle barrel, not to shoot, to use as an obstacle, putting it in the space between the rider's reaching arm and the wagon, and the rider pulled back to avoid it, and his horse dropped a half stride, and that was enough. Rhett drove them another quarter mile before he slowed. The road behind was empty. The Southern riders had pulled up. The Northern group was visible at a distance, still reorganizing. Cutter was somewhere in the dark off the east side of the road, and Rhett was about to say something about it when Lydia sat up and whistled once, a particular sound, something she'd developed over months in the eastern grass. And after a silence of about 30 seconds, hoofbeats came out of the dark. Cutter appeared at the roadside and fell in beside the wagon as though he'd merely stepped away briefly and was now returning to the expected arrangement. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Tessa said, "Is everyone in one piece?" "Yes," Lydia said. "Yes," Rhett said. "Good." Tessa set the rifle back in its scabbard. Her hands were not entirely steady, and she knew it, and she pressed them flat against her knees until they settled. "Let's go home." They reached the ranch well after dark, cold and wrung out, and sat by the fire without speaking at any length for the better part of an hour. The prize money went into the lockbox with the remaining document copies. The horses were settled. The shack held its warmth against the November cold with the modest competence of a repaired structure that had been given exactly the care it needed, and no more. Word moved through the territory faster than Rhett expected, which was the nature of things said in front of 60 people at a regional fair. In the weeks that followed, the circuit judge in Millhaven opened a formal inquiry into the land transactions brokered by Edmund Holt. Holt, faced with the prospect of county scrutiny and the organized testimony of 7 families who had compared documents and found consistent discrepancies, chose a course of action that Aldous had not predicted. He spoke to the inquiry. He provided records. He explained in detail the arrangement under which he had operated. Whether this was conscience or self-preservation was a question people argued about in Coldwater Crossing for months afterward. The practical result was the same either way. Aldis's lawyers fought. They were capable lawyers, and they fought effectively on several fronts, and the legal process ground forward at the pace legal processes take, slowly, with reversals, with moments where it seemed like the whole thing might collapse back into the familiar arrangement of powerful men and quietly buried paperwork. But there were too many people watching now, too many families who had compared numbers and found the same pattern. The inquiry became an investigation. The investigation produced findings. The holdings that Aldis had assembled through Holt's brokerage were subject to review. 3 of the 7 sales were found to involve fraudulent assessment misrepresentation. The families who had sold, or their survivors, were entitled to remedy through the county court. Aldis did not go to prison. Rhett had never expected him to. The frontier's legal machinery was not built for that kind of outcome, not in the time frame of a single winter. What happened instead was a series of financial penalties, an enforced unwinding of two of the land acquisitions, and, more damaging than any of it, in the economy of frontier reputation, the complete and public destruction of the credibility that had made him operable. He couldn't make offers on land anymore without people asking questions he couldn't deflect. He couldn't use brokerages without those brokerages understanding that the transactions would be examined. The thing he'd built had depended on nobody looking at the whole picture at once, and Tessa Hale had stood at a fairground and shown 60 people the whole picture at once, and that could not be undone. His supporters moved away from him the way water moves away from a stone. Not dramatically, just persistently, until there was a distance between them that made any further association impractical. The sabotage at the Mercer Ranch stopped immediately. Whether Aldous had ordered it to stop, or whether the men who'd been doing it had simply reassessed their employment options, Rhett couldn't say. The fence posts stayed where they were put. The garden was unmolested. Nobody appeared on the road at night. What came in place of the hostility was something quieter and harder to adjust to. Presence. The first person to come was the gray-haired man who'd spoken at the fair about Henry Brower. His name was Amos Cutler, and he arrived one Saturday morning with a post-hole digger and an offer of 2 days' labor. He didn't explain himself at length. He said the south fence needed rerunning, and he knew how to run fence, and he had time. Red accepted without making it complicated. Clara Vesper came the following week with her husband and a half-wagon load of seed stock, winter wheat and spring onion sets, more than they could use in a single planting. "We had extra," she said, which was not entirely true, and everyone present understood that, and nobody said so. A woman named Judith Marsh, who had never spoken to any of them, came on a Wednesday with a goat that had stopped producing and that she said she couldn't feed through winter. "She'll come back if she's kept right," she said. She left the goat and left. The goat's name, Lydia determined, was May, and May came back within 3 weeks. They were small things, these arrivals. They didn't restore the ruined crop or replace what the winter would still cost them in careful rationing, but they had a cumulative weight that Rhett found himself unprepared for, the weight of being seen by people who had decided, on the basis of something they'd witnessed, that they were worth appearing for. He'd forgotten what that felt like, or possibly he'd never known it exactly in this form. Not charity. Nothing here was charity. Something more like the particular acknowledgement that exists between people who have watched each other's conduct in hard circumstances and reached a conclusion about it. Tessa handled it with characteristic practicality, accepting each offer of help with genuine but unsentimental thanks and immediately identifying how to put it to use. Lydia continued her work with the horses, undistracted by the changes around the ranch, maintaining the same evening hours and the same quality of unhurried attention. Cutter's mares had settled into the eastern pasture now, as though they'd always been there, and Lydia moved among them daily with her quiet methodology, and people who came to the ranch in those weeks and saw it for the first time always stopped when they first saw Lydia in the field with the horses, stopped and stood and watched in the particular way of people observing something they know they'll describe to others later. The winter came in hard at the end of November. The North Ridge filled with snow, and the river froze along its shallows, and the road into Coldwater Crossing became a matter of timing and daylight. The shack held. The well held. The goat May held, and produced milk again by December, as Judith Marsh had said she would. They got through it. Not gracefully. There were hungry days and cold nights when the fire struggled, and an argument between Rhett and Tessa in December that was ostensibly about the allocation of firewood, but was actually about the accumulated stress of 3 people living in close proximity under difficult conditions, and that resolved itself imperfectly and took several days to fully settle. These were not small things. They were the texture of the actual winter, and they were hard, and anyone who would tell it differently wasn't telling the truth. But they got through it. And on the far side of it, when the snow came off the ridge in March, and the dark earth showed itself again along the north field, and the cottonwood trees put out their first pale green, the 40 acres looked different than it had looked the autumn before. Not transformed, still rough, still thin in places, still carrying the marks of what it had been through, but inhabited, recognizably and durably inhabited, by people who had decided to stay and had done what staying required. That was enough. For now, it was enough. Spring came the way it always came on the Eastern Territory. Not gently, not with any particular announcement, but with a kind of blunt insistence that was difficult to argue with. The snow came off the ridge in sheets one week, and the ground was frozen solid the next. And then one morning in late March, Rhett walked out to the well, and the air had changed in some quality he couldn't name precisely, something in the temperature and the smell of it, and he stood there for a moment with the bucket in his hand and understood that the worst of it was behind them. He didn't say that out loud. The frontier had a way of punishing premature declarations, but the north field that he turned in the first week of April had a different quality than the soil he'd broken the previous spring, a season of worked ground, of water management, of the particular attention that Tessa had given it through the fall before the crops were destroyed. All of that had changed something in the composition of it. It was darker. It held moisture differently. When he put a handful of it to his nose, it smelled the way soil is supposed to smell, of something living rather than something merely inert. Tessa came out at mid-morning and crouched beside the turned row, and took her own handful and turned it in her fingers. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Better," she said. "Better," he agreed. They planted more that spring than the previous year. More variety, more acreage in the north section, a second kitchen garden plot that Tessa had designed over the winter on paper, working out the crop rotation with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. The seed stock from Clara Vesper went in first. The winter wheat that Amos Cutler had helped source came in alongside it. A neighbor to the north, a man named Peterson, who'd watched the Ridgeline Fair proceedings from the edge of the crowd and said nothing at the time, arrived in April with an offer to share a plow team for the heavy turning, which cut their labor time by 2/3. Rhett accepted. He was getting better at accepting things. That was not a small change. It was, in some ways, the largest change of the year, though it happened quietly and without ceremony, the way the real changes tend to happen. The Rhett Mercer, who had leaned against a fence post at a frontier auction 14 months ago, with $43 and no plan had been held together largely by the habit of not needing anyone. That habit had been useful once, maybe necessary, in the aftermath of Denton and the loss of everything he'd built with a man he'd trusted. But habits that keep you alive in one season can quietly starve you in another, and he'd spent enough time watching Tessa work, watching the way she asked for information directly and gave help directly and treated every transaction between people as a thing that could be clean and mutual, that something in his own operating logic had begun to shift. He still wasn't easy. He was still the man who went quiet in groups and watched doorways out of habit and found it difficult to say the simple things. But he was different from what he'd been, and the difference mattered. The horses were the thing that changed everything else. By the second summer, Lydia had 11 horses working the eastern pasture, the original 5 from Cutter's band, 3 additional Mustangs she'd gentled over the winter from a second group that had drifted onto the territory, and 3 more that Peterson had brought to her in April with the admission that they were unworkable by anyone else he'd tried. She was 12 years old and she had a waiting list. That was how Amos Cutler put it, with his usual dry directness, when he came to the ranch one evening and found 3 neighboring ranchers' horses in the east pasture and Lydia moving among them in the low light. "That girl has a waiting list," he said to Rhett, with the tone of someone reporting a civic phenomenon. "I heard Garvey say he's been asking her for 2 months, and she told him she'd get to him when she got to him." "She did say that," Rhett confirmed. Cutler looked at him. "She's 12. "She is. And she told Garvey, Vernon Garvey, who runs 400 head, to wait his turn." "She's got a system," Rhett said. "She won't take more than she can handle at once. She says it's not fair to the horses." Cutler shook his head slowly, not in disapproval, in the manner of a man genuinely revising his picture of something. "What do you charge?" "Ask Tessa. She handles the fees." Tessa had established a fee structure in February with the same clear-eyed practicality she'd brought to the Ridgeline documents, reasonable enough that people didn't balk, specific enough that there was no ambiguity about what was included and what wasn't. The horse work became real income before summer, the first income the ranch had generated beyond subsistence. It didn't make them wealthy. It made them stable in a way that subsistence never fully is, which is a different and more durable thing. The crop harvest that second fall was not remarkable. It was adequate, enough to carry them through winter without rationing, enough surplus to sell a modest portion at the Coldwater Crossing market, enough that Rhett did not spend October doing the anxiety arithmetic he'd done the October before. He took that as a victory because it was won, even if it didn't look like much from the outside. What was building through all of this practical accumulation was something harder to quantify. In the spring of the third year, a woman appeared at the ranch gate on a Tuesday morning with 2 children and a problem that she explained to Tessa in a low, controlled voice on the porch while Rhett worked the north field within earshot. Her name was Ruth Calloway. Her husband had left in November and had not come back, and the holding on their property was set to expire at the end of the month, and she did not have the means to cover it or anywhere to go. Rhett kept working. He listened to Tessa's voice, which was even and practical, and did not perform sympathy, but was not without it. He heard Tessa ask specific questions about the property, the expiration terms, the children's ages. He heard the conversation arrive at something. That evening, Tessa told him about it. "I said she could stay in the shack annex until the end of summer, long enough to find a real arrangement." The shack annex was a room they'd built onto the back of the structure the previous fall, intended as storage. It was barely adequate as a living space for 3 people. Rhett looked at Tessa and said, "All right." "She's not asking for charity," Tessa said. "She knows how to preserve food. She said she'd work the kitchen garden through summer." "All right," he said again. Tessa looked at him for a moment, then, "You didn't argue." "Was I supposed to?" She smiled, which was not something she did with great frequency, and which therefore landed with the weight of something particular when it appeared. "A year and a half ago you might have." He thought about that. "A year and a half ago I was living alone on 40 acres with nothing but bad habits and a gruel mare. And now?" He looked out the window at the east pasture where Lydia's horses moved in the late light, and at the north field showing its turned rows, and at the fence line that had been rebuilt 3 times and stood now as though it intended to stay. "Now I'm living on 40 acres with better habits," he said, "and more people than I planned on." Ruth Calloway stayed through summer. She was a meticulous and unsentimental woman who worked the kitchen garden with a precision that made even Tessa revise some of her methods. And her children, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6, spent their days at Lydia's heels with the unself-conscious devotion that children give to the people who treat them as capable of understanding things. Lydia taught them both the fundamental language of horses, how to approach, how to stand, how to read the position of an ear or the quality of a breath. By August, the boy could halter a calm horse without assistance. In September, when the Calloway holding formally expired and Ruth was facing the question of what came next, Amos Cutler arrived with an offer, a small property 2 miles north that had come available, reasonable terms, and a personal guarantee to the county office that Ruth Calloway was a reliable party. He put the offer to her directly and without ceremony, and she accepted it the same way, and that was that. Rhett watched this happen and thought about the machinery of it, the invisible network of small decisions and demonstrated reliability and community attention that had produced this outcome for a woman he'd known for 3 months, and that had not existed, not in any functional way, when they'd first driven out to this land in the dark. He thought about Tessa standing at a fairground with papers in her hands, showing 60 people the whole picture at once. He thought about what that had done, not just to Aldis's operation, but to the fabric of how people in this territory related to each other. When someone demonstrates publicly that the picture is larger than any one person's view of it, that things connect in ways you couldn't see from your own property line, it changes something. People start looking up from their own situations and finding the edges of other people's and making contact there. That contact, accumulated, was what had brought Amos Cutler to Ruth Calloway's situation. Not generosity in the abstract, the specific practiced generosity of a community that had been reminded it was one. The inquiry into Aldis's land dealings resolved in the autumn of the 3rd year. It resolved imperfectly, as these things do. The financial remedies awarded to the 7 families were less than what had been taken, because the legal process filtered and reduced as legal processes do, and the lawyers on both sides consumed a portion of what remained. 2 of the families received enough to materially improve their situations. The others received something which was more than they'd had going in, and which represented the acknowledgement that what had been done to them was wrong, an acknowledgement that carries its own weight separate from the money. Edmund Holt lost his brokerage license. He moved east and was not heard from again in the territory, which was the frontier equivalent of a conclusion. Warren Aldis remained. He still had his 11,000 acres, reduced by the unwound acquisitions but fundamentally intact. He still ran cattle. He still had his rail contracts. He was not ruined in any practical sense of the word, but he was changed in the way that a man is changed when the mechanism of his power has been made visible to the people it operated on. Not destroyed, but stripped of the invisibility that had made it work. He had to operate differently, more carefully, with an awareness of observation that he hadn't required before. That constraint was its own kind of consequence. He never came after the Mercer Ranch again. Whether that was calculation or something closer to a concession was not something Rhett spent time analyzing. What mattered was the fact of it. Lydia turned 13 in the 4th year and 14 in the 5th and continued to be exactly what she had always been, only more so and with increasing technical precision. She had begun, somewhere in the 3rd year, to teach, not formally, not in any organized way at first, but because the neighboring children came to watch her work, and she could not be near someone who wanted to learn something without teaching them. The boy from the Calloway household had been the first. Others followed. By the 5th year, she had a loose rotation of 6 children ranging from 8 to 15 who came to the ranch on alternating days and learned under her quiet instruction the foundational principles of working with horses. She charged nothing for this. When Tessa raised the question, not arguing, just raising it, because Tessa accounted for everything, Lydia said, "My father never charged anyone for what he knew about land. He said knowledge isn't worth hoarding." Tessa looked at her for a long moment. "Your father also lost his land," she said, not unkindly. "He lost his land because someone took it," Lydia said, "not because he shared what he knew." That was the end of the conversation, and the teaching continued at no charge, and over time this produced something that pure commerce could not have produced. A circle of young people in the Eastern Territory who understood horses in a way that the previous generation largely hadn't, and who associated that understanding with the Hale name, and who carried both things forward into their own lives and operations. It is worth saying plainly, none of this was uncomplicated. Rhett and Tessa argued through the 4th and 5th years with the particular regularity of two people who share a vision and disagree, sometimes bitterly, about the method. She thought he was too slow to ask for help when the ranch needed it. He thought she took on obligations before assessing the cost. They were both partially right, which is the usual condition of arguments between capable people who care about the same things. There was a week in the 4th winter when the tension between them was bad enough that Lydia, who rarely intervened in anything, came and sat at the table between them during supper and said, without preamble, "You're both being difficult, and I'd like to eat without the atmosphere." The atmosphere was sufficiently improved by the directness of this that they managed to get through the meal and sort out the underlying disagreement by the following morning. Lydia accepted their thanks with a small nod and went back to the horses. There were seasons of scarcity, not as bad as that first winter, but lean, and lean seasons test the fabric of things in ways that comfortable seasons don't. There was illness. Rhett in the 3rd year, a chest illness that lasted 3 weeks and left him depleted for 2 months, during which time Tessa ran the ranch on her own and did not sleep enough and took it out on no one but herself. There were losses. 2 horses in the 4th year to a sickness that moved through the eastern pasture faster than anyone could manage it, and Lydia's grief at that was quiet and deep and took longer to resolve than she let people see. None of it broke them, but none of it was supposed to look like it hadn't cost anything either. The ranch expanded in the 5th year through the purchase of an adjacent 12 acres to the east, the acquisition of a property whose owner had moved to be closer to family, conducted at fair market value through transparent county documentation, in a way that Rhett was aware was a pointed contrast to how land had changed hands in this territory under the previous order. They paid what it was worth. They had the paperwork recorded same week. The county recorder, a methodical woman who had watched the Aldis inquiry with professional interest, filed it the same day and told Tessa it was a pleasure to process a clean transaction. The 12 acres gave Lydia's horse operation room to grow. By the end of the 5th year, 20 horses moved through the eastern pasture in various stages of her patient process, and the reputation of the Mercer Hale horses had spread far enough that buyers were coming from outside the immediate territory to look at what she'd produced. She was 15 years old. A buyer from the Northern Rail Corridor came in September of the 5th year, a man named Forsyth, who ran a freight operation and needed reliable working horses at scale and had been told by 3 separate sources that the best horses available in the Eastern Territory came from a girl on a 40-acre homestead who had started with wild mustangs. He arrived expecting to find some kind of charming local oddity and found instead a young woman who walked him through 12 horses in 2 hours and explained the working qualities of each one with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about what a freight operation needed and selected accordingly. He bought 4 horses. He came back in the spring and bought 4 more. He told people in the Northern Corridor about it, and those people told people, and the name traveled. What Forsyth could not fully articulate to the people he told, though he tried several times in the rough vocabulary available to a practical freight operator, was the quality of what he'd observed in Lydia Hale beyond the horses themselves. It was something in the combination of the technical knowledge and the unhurried certainty and the complete absence of performance in the way she presented what she knew. She didn't sell him the horses. She showed him the horses and let him see what was true about them and trusted that what was true was sufficient. That quality, the willingness to simply be accurate and let the accuracy do the work, was rarer than it should have been, and Forsyth, who had spent 20 years buying things from people who oversold them, recognized it immediately and said so. Tessa heard this account third hand and told Rhett about it one evening by the fire. He listened without comment for a while. Then he said, "She's always been that way." "I know." Tessa was quiet for a moment. "But the world is starting to know it too, and that's different." "Is it good?" he said. "All the attention." Tessa considered this honestly. Some of it. Some of it she'll have to manage." She looked at the fire. "She'll manage it the same way she manages everything, on her own terms." He nodded. He believed that. That autumn, a boy of about 10 arrived at the ranch gate on a Thursday morning, alone, on a horse that was too large for him and looked like it had been going for some time. He had a split lip that was a day or 2 old, and a bundle of belongings that wasn't much, a change of clothes and a blanket, and a tin cup and a book with a broken spine. He sat on the horse at the gate and looked at the ranch with the specific expression of a child who has arrived somewhere after a long decision and is not certain of the reception. Rhett was working near the fence and saw him first. He walked to the gate and looked up at the boy. The boy looked back at him with eyes that had the same quality Tessa's had at the auction. The cataloging wariness of someone assessing whether the person in front of them was one of the kinds of trouble or another. "You lost," Rhett said. "No," the boy said. "I heard there's a woman here who works with horses." "There is. She's 15, and she teaches some." The boy looked past Rhett toward the pasture. "I can work," he said. "I'm good at it. I don't need much." Rhett looked at him for a long moment. The split lip, the too large horse, the bundle that wasn't much. He had seen the shape of this story before, in a different context, and he understood what it meant when someone arrived at a place with those particular elements. "Come inside," he said. "There's food." The boy's name was Dylan. He stayed 2 weeks and then 3, and then it became apparent that he was simply staying, the way these things sometimes become apparent without a formal declaration from anyone. Tessa negotiated the practical terms with the same clear-eyed directness she applied to everything: his work, his meals, his sleeping arrangement in the repaired annex room, and Lydia took him into her teaching rotation without ceremony. He turned out to have a natural instinct with horses that was not Lydia's level, but was genuinely good, the kind of goodness that responds to proper instruction rather than the kind that has to be constructed from nothing. Lydia told him this in the same direct way she told him everything, which was, "You're better than most people who start, but you're impatient with them, and they know it. They'll trust you less for it." Dylan thought about this. "How do you stop being impatient?" "I'm not sure you stop," Lydia said. "I think you just get slower at showing it, and then slower at feeling it." She looked at the horse he'd been working. "Go again. Start from the beginning." He went again. He started from the beginning. Dylan was not the lass, Over the years that followed, and this account must carry forward beyond the tight frame of a single story, because some things only become visible at distance, the ranch on the 40 eastern acres developed a quality that was not planned and could not have been engineered. It became the kind of place that people in difficult circumstances somehow heard about, through the informal and powerful channel of word passed between people who needed to know such things. Families in trouble, children without arrangements, women whose circumstances had collapsed, people at the beginning of the decision that takes you somewhere you haven't been, looking for evidence that the somewhere exists. Not all of them stayed. Most came through, took what they needed, a season's stability, a practical skill, the simple experience of being treated as someone whose situation could be improved, and moved forward into their own versions of things. Some stayed longer. A few stayed a great while. The ranch grew to accommodate this, imperfectly and incrementally, one addition at a time, a second annex, a proper barn in the 6th year, built with help from 12 neighboring families over a weekend in May, a workshop that Tessa designed for preserving and processing food, which became its own small enterprise and trained more people in more seasons than anyone initially expected. It was not a utopia. It had the friction and the personality conflicts and the resource arguments and the occasional complete failures that any real human enterprise has. Things went wrong regularly and were fixed imperfectly and went wrong again. Rhett remained difficult in the specific ways he had always been difficult. Tessa continued to take on more than she should, and to acknowledge this only when pushed. Lydia remained so genuinely unconcerned with other people's opinions of her methods that it occasionally created problems with the people whose cooperation she needed. None of them became different people. They became more fully themselves, which is what happens when you stay somewhere long enough and work hard enough, and the place becomes real. What changed was what surrounded them. The name Mercer Hale, which had been a punchline at an auction on a mud-gray morning in Coldwater Crossing, became something else. Not famous exactly. Fame is a particular and often damaging thing, and this was different from that. It became known in the specific and durable way that a thing becomes known when many people have had a direct experience of it and found it to be what it said it was. The horses were what said it first and most loudly, because horses are honest testimony. When a Mercer Hale horse worked for a freight company or a homestead or a ranch operation and worked well and reliably, that was information. That information traveled. But it was the other thing, the quality of the place itself, what it did for the people who came through it, that lasted longest in the account of it that people carried. Rhett thought about this over the years in the particular way he thought about things, not continuously, but returning to it at intervals, turning it in his mind during the early mornings when he was first up, and moving through the ranch before anyone else was awake. He had not intended to build something. He had intended, on the morning of that auction, simply to prevent a specific outcome. He'd had $43 and a dead man's deed and an impulse he still couldn't fully account for, and he had acted on it, and the acting had produced a direction that had produced everything else. He didn't think that made him a particularly admirable person. He thought it made him a person who had, at a critical moment, been slightly less willing than usual to look away from something that required a response. That was a small thing. It had large consequences. He wasn't sure what to make of that ratio, ethically or otherwise, and he suspected that anyone who was sure what to make of it was probably wrong. What he knew, what he could say with the confidence of someone who had lived it through rather than reasoned his way to it, was that the version of himself who had survived Denton by closing off was not a version that could have built anything. Survival and building are not the same project, and the tools useful for one can actively undermine the other. He had needed Tessa's demand for mutual decision-making, which had felt like an intrusion on his autonomy at the time, and turned out to be the thing that kept the enterprise from being just another solitary man's solitary failure. He had needed Lydia's uncomplicated example of what it looked like to be exactly what you were without apology, without strategy, without the armor of maintained distance. He had needed, in the end, to be needed, which is a harder thing to admit than it sounds, for a man who had organized his entire middle years around the project of needing no one. In the 7th year, on a morning in October that had the same quality as that first October morning when he'd stood in the ruined north field and looked at the hoofprints in the soil, Rhett walked the full perimeter of the ranch. All 52 acres now, with the East Edition. He walked the fence line the way he had walked it on the very first morning, at dawn, alone, before anyone else was up, and noted what he saw. The fences were solid. The north field was harvested and turned for spring. The barn stood straight and full against the cold. The east pasture held 14 horses in Lydia's current rotation, their shapes dark and still in the early light. The workshop was quiet at this hour, but would be producing by mid-morning. The annex rooms were occupied by 3 people in various stages of the particular process of finding their footing. He stopped at the north corner of the property where the cottonwood trees stood and looked back at the whole of it. It was not what he had pictured. He hadn't pictured anything that first night, sitting by the dying fire with 2 strangers sleeping behind him and 40 acres of cracked earth ahead. You can't picture something you haven't begun yet. The picture assembles itself through the accumulated decisions, one after another, and by the time it's visible, you're already inside it. He heard footsteps behind him and turned. Tessa was coming across the grass in her coat, a cup in each hand, having anticipated, as she frequently anticipated, that he would be here at this time and would want coffee. She handed him a cup and stood beside him and looked at the ranch the same way he'd been looking at it. "What are you thinking about?" she said. He considered the honest answer. "The auction," he said, "that morning. I think about it too sometimes." "What do you think about it?" She was quiet for a moment. The cottonwood leaves moved in the early wind, the same sound they'd made on that first night. Long, slow, like something settling. "I think about what would have happened if you hadn't bid," she said. "If Harlan had won." She paused. "And I think that's the wrong thing to think about because it didn't happen, but I think about it anyway." "And what do you decide?" "I decide that I'm glad you were there," she said, "and also that you were an idiot to spend everything you had on strangers." "Both things can be true," he said. "They usually are," she said. They stood there for a while longer, drinking their coffee while the ranch woke around them. The sounds of the horses beginning to move in the east pasture, the first smoke from the workshop flew, the particular quality of light that comes when a cold October morning decides to be clear. When Rhett eventually looked back over the arc of those years, what he kept returning to was not the dramatic moments, not the auction or the blocked road or the fairground or the riders in the dark. Those moments mattered, and they were real, and they had produced real things. But they were not the substance of it. The substance of it was the accumulated ordinary. The mornings in the field, the arguments that resolved and the ones that took longer, the people who came through and the ones who stayed, the horses that moved through Lydia's careful hands, the documents Tessa organized and the questions she asked, and the communities she built between people who hadn't known they were already part of one. The meals, the fireside conversations, the first time Lydia laughed at something Dylan said, and the whole room felt different for it. The look on Amos Cutler's face the first time he saw what the North Field produced. The coffee, on October mornings, handed across the cold air between 2 people who had built something together and knew the cost of it and had decided the cost was worth it. That was the actual thing. Unglamorous, impermanent, continuously requiring maintenance, the way all real things are. The legacy of it was not a monument. It was not a name on a building or a plaque on a post or a story told in the way of legends, cleaned up and simplified for people who wanted the version without the difficult middle sections. The legacy of it was in the people who passed through and carried something forward, the young horse trainers Lydia taught, who trained horses of their own, the families who had come through the annex rooms and built stability elsewhere, and extended the same to others when the time came. The ranchers who had learned, at a fairground on a November afternoon, that looking at the whole picture was both possible and necessary. That kind of legacy doesn't announce itself. It just continues. Rhett Mercer was not remembered, in the end, as the cowboy everyone feared. He was remembered as the man at the auction, which is how the story was told in those parts for a long time afterward. Not the full story, which is long and complicated and resistant to simplification, but the image at the center of it. A man with $43 and a dead man's deed who put his hand up in a muddy yard before a laughing crowd. Not because he had a plan, not because he was certain of anything, but because something in him that day was slightly less willing than usual to look away. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. It turned out to be more than enough. The cottonwood leaves moved in the wind, the cold October air carried the smell of turned earth and distant wood smoke. And the ranch that had been 40 acres of cracked hardpan and a half-collapsed shack went on being what it had become. Not perfect, not permanent in any final sense, but real and inhabited, and tended by people who had chosen it and each other with open eyes. That choosing, done daily, without guarantee, that was the thing that mattered. Not the grand gesture at the beginning, not the dramatic confrontation in the middle, but the 10,000 ordinary choices after that to stay, to work, to remain accountable to the people beside you. That is what the frontier asked of everyone who tried to build something in it. Most people never understood that the asking was also the answer. These three did.